Hello, Avatar fans, and welcome to the next episode of the Avatar Online podcast. This is going to be episode 296 of our regular shows, and we're recording this one on September 13th, 2025. This is the official podcast for the fan site, Avatar The Last Airbender Online.com, and I'm going to be your main host, Morgan Airspeed Prime. Joining me on the podcast is Greg2B from the site.
What's up, everyone?
Excellent. So on today's show, we are mostly going to be reviewing the second half of the novel City of Echoes, Avatar Legends Book 1, and then we'll be finishing it off in the next podcast. To start with, we only have one small bit of news. There really hasn't been much news over the last kind of 2 weeks since the last podcast. So we'll just jump in with this kind of interesting one that the fandom has been discussing a little bit from the past few days. And that is that the official Avatar Legends Instagram has been teasing the idea of course, the 20th anniversary kind of version of Avatar in concert. And there's at least 2 videos that they have here highlighting some of the special stuff that they filmed that they're going to use during the concerts that they filmed at San Diego Comic-Con back a few weeks ago. And it's weird because they're definitely hyping it up quite heavily. Like, they're talking about, like, we filmed something really special for it, curious what it is, you're not ready for what's coming. And the video does seem to just be them asking questions to the cast, and it's a bit unclear about what that's actually going to be in the concert. The second video does actually include Mike and Brian, but again, they just highlight we filmed something special again with the ATLA people at Comic-Con. Here's what we've been cooking. Some secrets are too good to spill out at once. And it's like, what are they really getting at here? Because it is a little vague in the description as to what exactly the difference between the normal concert and the anniversary concert really is. To the point where, like, I'm still not entirely sure what it is. Some of the recent shows, it does seem like at least include some aspects of the anniversary to it. And I think someone said at one of the Mexican shows recently, it's mostly just that, like, it's a big intermission kind of video package thing where, like, it includes promos for, like, Avatar Magic the Gathering, the Realms Collide mobile game. It does include some voice actor interviews, but it seems like it was pretty small scale and not particularly interesting or exciting. But that they did show, like, the logo for the Aang movie and the image of Seven Havens. So they're, like, including that kind of anniversary news in all of this. But that news is stuff that's already been posted about on the, like, official Instagram. So what's kind of happening here? It all seems to be building up to the idea that I believe today is the first Avatar in concert showing that is meant to be, like, quote unquote officially like a 20th anniversary showing. Because it's it's in Arizona, I think, later on today. That when they first announced the anniversary, this was the one that was at the top of the list. And I guess they've included some stuff in some of the other showings. Very unclear as to what exactly is going on here, but what do you make of all this teasing for the concert?
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I get the idea of trying to, like, hype it up for this year and to show that it's a standout and that it, means something. So, that's cool as far as, like, fandom and, bringing it back into the fold. And, of course, this is going to continue on into the movie, into all the other new projects. So I guess it's a good, like, lead-in, you could say, to that. But in terms of, what it actually means for the concert, is it just, like, re-edits of what they show when you're there, or is it, like, additional merch when you're there that you could possibly buy? But a lot of stuff seems like it's for stuff that hasn't officially come out or anything like that. So, like, I doubt if they were gonna, like, sneak peek any sort of, like, merchandise that's to be out soon or something like that. They do sell merch at the concert and stuff, but that doesn't feel like the type of thing that they would do for this sort of type of stuff. So I don't know. I'm really curious. I mean, the videos seem like they're just sort of like, cast stuff that they're going to put in before, the movie, or maybe it'll be like in the concert or during, like, the intermission, something like that, which would be cool to have. They usually do have something in the middle there just to keep people entertained while they're waiting to, like, reset up and take a break and stuff like that. So it could definitely be, a neat addition if you're already planning to go into the concert, but I don't know. I don't know if we're like reading too much into it in the hype sort of, cycle of things, or if it really is going to be something. I'm not sure. I mean, it seems like they did it when they, just happened to all be together at one place, which was SDCC. So I don't know. I don't know if it's something we should really be that hyped about, compared to any of the new projects that are coming out.
Yeah, because like I suppose like if it is some sort of piece of news, the only thing like I could think of is just that like are they going to use the first like American show like tonight to debut something new, like the first image of the movie? Maybe if they like make a giant deal out about it and post that video online for everyone. But like if they keep it exclusive to the people attending there and it's like meant to be a secret if you attend, I don't really know how much that's going to work if it is just like a kind of intermission video package type thing. And this is always the thing with like the cast and crew where like, okay, this is probably exciting behind the scenes if you were involved in the filming of all of this, but it's not these days maybe the most interesting thing overall. And we kind of saw that from the Comic-Con panel where the news was the Seven Havens image. Like, it was cool that there was a script reading for the rest of the panel, but no one's really focused in on that aspect of it overall, to the point where I think most of the fandom are not really aware what happened at the 20th anniversary panel outside of the Seven Havens image and the brief mention of the movie that they kind of gave. So like 90% of the panel was not talked about. And it's the same thing going into New York Comic Con, where we also have an anniversary panel, and it's like, well, there's no mention that the creators are going to be there. We don't know for sure yet. If it is just the cast, is that just going to be basically SDCC without the news, or are they going to deliver news in some other way? It's a bit unclear. But yeah, it's definitely the social media, I think, just kind of being weird about when they do and don't hype things, in the sense that like we're going to talk in depth about like one of the bigger pieces of content that's going to release this year, and I'm pretty sure on the whole Instagram there's maybe like one post mentioning that City of Echoes released, yet there's 2-3 a million things about the concert, and it's just like they're hyping up voice actor interviews and not like a new piece of content necessarily. It's weird how they kind of go about this sometimes, but I guess we'll see maybe over the coming days if there is anything to this or not. I think we're just looking for news wherever we can get it, and it's going to be telling, I suppose, if they do anything here, then it's New York Comic Con, and if not, then it's actually a little bit unclear when we will get news next, because I'm pretty sure like the first event next year is probably not until like April, so we could be waiting a while for the next news. So bit of a tough one in that regard, but otherwise, like the only real thing to mention is just that the next like proper release is Beasts of the Four Nations, which is only 2 weeks away basically. It's a book we've been waiting for quite a while, but it is finally going to release on September 23rd. I'm a little bit unclear about like how much like coverage necessarily we're going to be like doing on this. We'll I guess talk about it to a certain degree, but this goes from being almost like a lock-in like a few years ago, like we're definitely going to talk about this, to there might not actually be too much to talk about this if the preview pages are representative of what it is. But I suppose where are you at with Beasts of the Four Nations now, like under 2 weeks away from release?
I don't know. I'm like split on it, 50-50 in terms of like getting it immediately or just waiting, or seeing what people say about it or whatever, because it definitely has waned my interest on it over the years of it coming out and them sort of like shuttering it for a while.
But yeah, that's been the news right now. We're just waiting on other stuff to happen. So that will move us into our City of Echoes kind of review part 2. So obviously the book is split up into part 1, part 2, part 3. We covered the first 11 chapters, which is part 1. This one is going to be chapters 12 to 32. And then it'll be 33 to the end of the book on the next podcast. So this is actually the longest section of the book, but we'll group it together, so we won't be here like an eternity going through this. But there is some pretty interesting stuff here. So straight away, we start off with Jin's second delivery for what we will soon find out is the Silver Fangs. This time she's going to the upper ring for a very peculiar client that they need to impress, and it is revealed to be Madame Makmu Ling. So we know this character from the 575 Society, from the Tale of Sokka, from Tales of Ba Sing Se, and this is a very interesting cameo appearance from this character across this and the next couple of chapters. But for chapter 12, the main significance here is just that she gets this mission. You need to impress people up here. And then Xuan basically fixes up Jin so that she looks presentable for going to the upper ring. This is going to be her first time in the upper ring. And we really get to see how amazed she is by all of this as they just effortlessly get onto the train to the upper ring. Like, wow, this group actually has connections. We can just go here. And we see her looking at the train on the way across the monorail. And it's just that kind of contrast between Xuan, who's kind of done this before, and Jin, who's just like, this is like the coolest thing she's ever done. That, you know, there was kind of the dream between Susu and Jin in the early chapters of like, will they ever get to the upper ring? And here's a weird way that Jin is actually getting there. But what are your thoughts on this chapter?
Yeah, I thought this was really nice, the way that they broke down her sort of, coming from the lower ring to the upper ring, using the monorail, which was, we get to see it in the show, and our characters do write on it, but I think when you see it in this sort of way with the description that they have for it, it gives you a good bit more of like context of how it works and how it's powered by earthbenders, which seems like the most obvious thing to do, but they do it in a really cool way to describe it here, especially from her, this being her first time writing it, and sort of like putting her knees in the seat like a little kid looking on the outside. It's interesting to note this, considering Juan's sort of like fear of heights, how that sort of played into it here, because I didn't catch that the first time I was reading this, but it's cool to see his perspective of this as well. So I thought this was really nice for Jin to sort of get this sort of, I guess, peek into the upper crust of society, and just throughout all of her sort of, I guess you could say, dealings with the Silver Fang, how she, sort of realizes how, it's close and also very sort of far away of, what she and Susu hope to achieve.
Mm-hmm. And there is a little mention in terms of the Jin kind of Xuan dynamic of the idea that like, oh, my mother thinks you're like soft spoken and agreeable, but obviously myself and some of our classmates kind of think you're a bit kind of aloof, and it links into some of the stuff said in the previous chapters. And because this is kind of the character arc that Jin's going to go on over the next kind of like 5-6 chapters, like it's just worth kind of noting as well. Going into chapter 13, we see that like once they arrive in the upper ring, they pretty quickly get to the location here. Like it's the Flagrant Blossoms kind of institute, and they walk past stuff like the Autumn Wind Academy, the 575 Society, and you see that like the idea is Makmu Ling kind of runs this kind of almost like academy preparation school for like upper ring ladies, basically. That's sort of the idea of all of this, and Jin is just very taken aback by all of this. And there's some interesting kind of notes as we kind of go through this, where she kind of gets to see that like, oh, the upper ring girls don't have it like that well, because the training is really, really harsh to be that kind of perfect in high society. But some of the key details here are that really quickly Jin finds out that the delivery is for this high quality calligraphy brush from the Fire Nation. This is why it's like an illegal import. And then we eventually get to the meeting with Madame Makmu Ling, who we have, of course, met before during ATLA. And similar to the Professor situation from a few chapters back, she kind of takes this weird approach of like testing Jin. She doesn't just accept the delivery and Jin goes about her way. She's like asking her lots of questions of like, do you know what this is? And Jin is kind of forced to reveal that, yeah, she does know calligraphy very well. She understands how high quality of an item it is, leading to this kind of cliffhanger ending to the chapter where Makmu Ling kind of pulls a hidden knife on Jin, eager to know how she kind of knows so much about this, that, they're trying to get across that, okay, this has been okay for the most part, but actually it's still kind of criminal underworld activity going on here. And these people are involved in this sort of stuff. So a little bit of a different side to Mak Mu Ling compared to the more humorous interaction with Sokka. But what are your thoughts on chapter 13?
Yeah, this definitely has a bit more of an edge to the sort of interaction here, which I guess, kind of makes sense. Sokka was just sort of randomly coming in there, but, here, Madame Mak Mu Ling knows that this has, you know, other, meanings to actually having this imported into the Earth Kingdom, especially, considering the times and everything that's going on and the fact that, this random delivery girl, from her perspective at least, who she doesn't know who she is, since it isn't the normal person, of course. That's the whole reason why Jin is here. Knows a little bit too much than you would think. And, Jin, I guess she sort of tries to play it off because, like, she knows like the exact everything about the brush, but she does hold back just a little bit. But even, what she said already is a little bit like too much, like it gives away too much, which is why she's sort of in this position that she's in here. So I don't know, I thought this was really cool how they sort of, show sort of like, the sort of seriousness of the situation without it being like super high stakes, at least not yet. Like, well, we'll get to that later on, of course. But this is sort of, somewhat lower level, but still, she could get in trouble if this were to ever really get out and people sort of understood. Because, the guards, they did see what the brush was and, they sort of joke about that overall before, especially with Jun and sort of, how they view Madame Mak Mu Ling. But, they're not educated enough to really know, sort of what this is, which is, kind of cool how they're able to sort of pass this information along, throughout this whole sort of situation with things going on. So no, I thought this was really cool, sort of like, more of a seriousness of the situation that Jin is actually sort of encountering here.
Mm-hmm. Chapter 14 immediately kind of diffuses the situation because Jin just quickly explains that, hey, I'm a refugee. My grandfather does calligraphy, that's how I know about it. And Mak Mu Ling puts the knife away, of course. Leading on to the next stage of the test, which is that, okay, if that's the case, I want you to test the brush for me. So prepare this fancy ink with the fancy brush and, prove to me it's like a good item, basically. And Jin does this very well, it seems like. Mak Mu Ling is actually impressed by Jin. So much so that she actually gives Jin a haiku as a present. And Jin even writes this down to remember it. The haiku is gifted with intent, a delicate offering, such is spring, hopeful. And this is meant to be a little bit of a kind of proof for Jin that, hey, I'm not actually a disagreeable person. I can get on with even Mak Mu Ling. And the haiku is kind of a proof of that as well. So yeah, she comes out of this with the idea that Mak Mu Ling is happy to see her again. She will accept her as someone who can deliver stuff to the academy, I guess. And then when she goes back to Xuan, she considers telling him about Susu, but then last second she kind of refuses to once again. But because kind of he has done so much for her at this point, this time he's the one who kind of storms off upset from their conversation and kind of, I guess he still feels that she is maybe distrustful and disagreeable to a certain degree, which sets up the next couple of chapters of Jin having to kind of prove to herself that she's not actually that way, that this is the first real time where she didn't make the right choice in one of these interactions with Xuan. She probably should have opened up at this point, but for whatever reason she didn't. So this has all worked out pretty well, but what are your thoughts on chapter 14?
Yeah, Jin definitely has a lot of sort of, I guess you could say, just reluctance in trusting, which, I guess is pretty understandable considering the situation of the city and the kingdom and just the state of the Avatar world at that point in time here. And, she's been doing these dealings and, it seems like she's been doing pretty well. Like she is able to sort of, think on her feet pretty well. Her, pretty well educated background definitely comes into play here where she's able to, sort of pair the ink, in the proper way and sort of test things correctly and the brush strokes and everything like that. And she's, aware of how much, the cost and the value of everything that she's doing here. So I think, it comes through pretty well here that she can do, quite well for herself. But yeah, her interpersonal skills, at least with Jun, isn't quite sort of there yet, but you can see that they're sort of developing this sort of new friendship that they're maybe having at least at this point in time. And she's not really willing to sort of go out there yet, but she's at least at to the point where she's considering it, considering all that he has actually done for her, like you're saying.
Chapter 15 and 16 together are basically the date with Zuko from Jin's perspective. So this is a very fun one because, of course, this is effectively the only content with Jin prior to this novel actually coming out. So, you get to see like, oh, this is how they use that to kind of build the character around. So, yeah, what we do here as we start the chapter is that, basically the idea is that after Gwen stormed off, she's like, I can't believe he implied that about me. Disagreeable, difficult to get along with, a loner, is that true or not? Because she, after the meeting with Mushi, had decided to kind of take a new approach, but she kind of went back on that a little bit. And now she kind of feels she needs to prove to herself that, she can do stuff when Susu isn't around, that she can stand on her own, and that, she is actually a likable person like she is around like so many other characters. So she decides she's going to ask Lee at the tea shop out on a date. So she's nervous, but eventually goes up and asks him out, and we get the scene playing out exactly how it does in the episode, of course, where Mushi agrees to the date on like Zuko's behalf, and we kind of build to, of course, okay, scene cut, and here they are ready for the date. And it's mostly just the interesting part, especially early on, of just her reacting to a lot of the kind of Zuko oddness of just like his fancy hair, and she thinks it's sweet that he got so presentable for her. Of course, we find out that the two are like really, really nervous initially. She's almost like putting on an act of being particularly confident by like leading the conversation. She's almost acting a little bit like Susu is. But, we just get the explanation of them going to have the food and stuff like that. But we see that her kind of expectations, what she wants out of this is kind of interesting, where what if this turns into like her ultimate romance, so she can kind of have this amazing relationship kind of like her parents had. And we get little references to the fact that her father was the shy one, her mother was the one who actually kind of took the lead in that sort of thing, so she's going to do the same on this date. But yeah, this is where we kind of end this kind of first chapter of the date, is mostly just with the idea of realizing how nervous everything is. She asked the question of like, hey, what have you been doing before you came here? He gives the evasive answer. And this is maybe where we get into a little bit more kind of insight we maybe didn't know about before, which is just the idea that she has remembered in her head since the first scene where she kind of saw Lee, the fight with Jet, that he was accused of being a Fire Nation spy, and she has a feeling that might not be fully true. What would it mean if he actually was Fire Nation? So like that is on her mind, even if she, as of yet, doesn't have like proof of it. But like, why is she sort of okay with that being a thing and not like absolutely terrified at that prospect is sort of the idea. But what are your thoughts on this, getting a different perspective on this scene we know pretty well?
Yeah, no, I thought this was actually kind of cool. I mean, just to get sort of her internal monologue on the situation definitely gives you a new way of looking at the scene. I mean, I think, at the core of it, it is still the same, but, to see her idea of, why she wanted to date, how it compares to her parents and their sort of relationship, and, what it could mean for her going forward is, pretty intriguing, just to see sort of, where it could have potentially of, sort of ended up if, things were different, and how the situation actually sort of played out in the end. And just, the whole idea of just, the Fire Nation sort of backing of this, as another sort of, layer, I guess, of intrigue to where you finally get her sort of like, final, I guess you could say, conclusions on the date and sort of what it means for her, in the end, if he is or if he isn't, and, if it even matters to her.
Mm-hmm. Going into 16, we get the scene where he like juggles for her, and she's aware that like, okay, he's probably lying about that, but it was kind of cute that he actually like tried to kind of do it for her. And she kind of realizes that like, okay, this is going okay, but not like amazingly. It's probably not the destined relationship for my future. But one more attempt to make this happen, she brings him to the fire fountain, which of course is effectively kind of, the idea is like in a similar place. This is where her mother and father got together as a couple, so that's gonna be where it happens for her, is sort of the idea in her head. She does kind of question a little bit, like, what am I doing the right thing? Am I actually pursuing a relationship with Lee, or am I just trying to prove I'm not disagreeable? Do I actually think this might evolve into an actual relationship? She sees he's more relaxed now as the date has kind of gone on. This is where, of course, the fountain isn't lit. She closes her eyes, he lights them up, and we get her actual thoughts on this, which is that surely there's no way she closes her eyes, opens them up, and doesn't suspect something. And we see her dialogue in her head, which confirms that, yeah, there's no way for someone to light those torches so fast. I should be angry, I should accuse him of lying, and yet I remained there by his side in the quiet, watching the small boat float by on the water, a rare moment of serenity in the chaos of the city. And so the idea is, yeah, why isn't she freaked out by this? Because the Fire Nation like killed her family, and we immediately get the answer to that, which is this little story of I suppose her and Gong Gong on the way to Ba Sing Se, and that's that they nearly accidentally stumbled upon a Fire Nation encampment, but before they properly got caught, two of the soldiers basically just like told them to be quiet, go this way to kind of get around the camp, and that's how you'll get to Ba Sing Se. So Fire Nation soldiers actually like help them evade capture by the Fire Nation, and this is the idea of why she doesn't immediately assume Fire Nation equals bad guy, is because there are good people in the Fire Nation, and she assumes that Zuko, being here in the Earth Kingdom, must also be one of these people, because that's her experience on the date, that he's done little things to try and kind of make it a good night for her and so on. And I think that kind of works really, really well. This is when we build up to the kiss, of course, which we get a little bit of interesting context here, which is that she views this, going into this, as being more of a kind of good night kiss, kind of goodbye kiss. And so she's surprised when he kind of kisses back and then immediately goes to leave. And that's kind of where the chapter actually kind of comes to an end. With just the idea that she kind of compares herself like a little bit to him, of like, you know, there's a part of him he's buried so far down that he can pretend it no longer exists, and that, you know, that she has to figure herself out. He's doing the same. It probably wasn't ideal for both of them, but hey, it's not ended on too bad of terms. But what are your thoughts on the second chapter about the date?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, you know, it's nice that, you know, even if it isn't, you know, going to be this sort of like amazing thing that Jin sort of thought it could potentially be, it still was a pretty sort of, you know, nice out. And regardless of him, you know, most likely being Fire Nation, obviously, you know, something's happened in his life that has, you know, put him in the position that he's at right now. And, you know, she doesn't know any of the details, and, you know, she doesn't really find out any of those things. But, you know, it's enough to come to an understanding that, you know, it isn't sort of like the end of the world that he is actually there, at least not at this current time. So I like that sort of detail there, and that fact that, you know, they do try to show through her sort of history of getting to Ba Sing Se that, you know, maybe not all of the Fire Nation are as bad as, you know, they're let out to be, you know, believed. You know, there still are a lot of them, and the ones in charge are probably the worst, but, you know, the ones that are there sort of dealing with things have, you know, some heart, some sort of compassion here. So no, I think that's a very sort of like, you know, nice and mature outlook that we're sort of given of Jin and sort of her view of things, which, you know, isn't something that you always see in our young characters.
Going to chapter 17, we get a small reflection afterwards on the date where, like, she had fun talking to Lee. It didn't go as she expected, but she's just happy to have done something normal for the first time in a very, very long time. Just go out, have fun as a kid, like the other kids do. And And the main thing that she comes out of this with is just the idea. She kind of has proven herself to herself. She isn't disagreeable. She is going to go talk to Xuan again. She does want to join the Silver Fangs properly and prove that she can be an asset to whatever the group is actually called, because she doesn't know that yet. So yeah, she goes over to him at the academy, kind of talks to him. She does have the big kind of reflection moment in the middle of this where she realizes that, like, oh yeah, I don't actually talk to the other people at school, and I maybe am a little bit too closed off, because these recent kind of weeks, I guess, of talking to Xuan is like the only time I've ever really talked to anyone else in class. So yeah, she reluctantly has to admit that, but she confirms she wants to be a part of whatever he's involved with overall. This is where she does fill him in about the whole Susu situation. This is why she's so devoted to getting the kind of money. He just tries to be kind of clear about the idea of, like, are you sure you want to get involved in this? Are you sure you have what it takes? You want to go this deep into what we're involved in? Which she takes maybe slightly in maybe the wrong way, like, oh, he doesn't think I have what it takes, when he's just looking out for her. But afterwards, this is where she goes back to Pao's tea house, and this is where she finds out that Lee and Mushi have left already for the upper ring. They're getting their own tea shop, and she has an interesting reaction to this, where she kind of, I guess, is happy for them to a certain degree, but then because it's proof that some people can fulfill their dreams. But from her perspective, it's kind of like all the good things, the good people around her seem to always leave the lower ring in some way or another. In that, like, it's first Susu, now Lee is gone and she doesn't get to say goodbye. This bitter feeling of just this keeps happening to her, which I think is a very interesting kind of angle at the end of this, where there's so many different kind of feelings of this kind of reveal of, like, yeah, she didn't see him again. We'll talk about going home again, I guess, whenever it comes up. But what are your thoughts on chapter 17?
Yeah, I think, her perspective, it definitely can feel like everything's sort of, out to get her or to leave her sort of behind, and she's just sort of stuck at her place here. And she is trying to move forward. She does talk to Zun to sort of join the group that she doesn't, quite know, but she wants to make it seem like she's, ready and available, for this endeavor, whatever it actually is. We'll see how she feels about that in a bit here. But yeah, it definitely, it's interesting to get her idea on, I guess, just sort of the situation of, again, sort of being in the lower ring and having to deal with things on the day-to-day that, other people might not necessarily have to confront, on the regular. And she's just doing it, almost sort of by herself now, without even Susu to sort of back her up. And she definitely is sort of, I guess, sort of feeling the strain of everything going on and sort of being, more alone compared to a lot of her other, students or friends or potential friends or, people who are around her sort of age here, which, just before she was feeling a bit better about her situation, but now it seems like it brought her right back down.
Mm-hmm. Chapter 18. So we actually finally get the explanation about, like, who is Xuan and also Jin now working for. So we get the name Silver Fangs finally brought up officially for the first time here. What is it? It's a syndicate of business associates who work together for protection and their own interests, but one of those interests is to help the poorest people in the lower ring, and that includes any kind of newcomers, refugees to the city. And the idea is that they all work together to ensure that the money that kind of exchanges hands doesn't go to corrupt officials, and instead actually properly moves between the rings of the city. And this kind of helps to explain how, I suppose, like, middle ring Professor uses lower ring people to deliver for him, why upper ring people like Mak Muling would also kind of facilitate this happening. They're all interests are all aligned that this is actually the best way to make this happen, because maybe this is something the book maybe should make clear maybe a little bit more regularly across the book. But, like, yeah, the officials are kind of corrupt effectively throughout all the Ba Sing Se for the most part. So this is why even wealthy people in the upper ring still use the Silver Fangs, and why it's not just everything against the lower ring. There's actually a lot of people who want to help people out in that regard, and that's why, like, I guess and Mok Mu-ling were kind of testing Jin, because with Jin they actually have someone with a lot of potential that they can use, who just happens to be from the lower ring. It's a really interesting reveal. There'll be a few extra kind of details added onto this as the chapters kind of go on, but I suppose before we get to the end of the chapter, what were your thoughts when finally they actually explain what the whole idea with the Silver Fangs is?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a cool sort of, way that they're sort of setting up that there's a way to sort of support the lower class citizens in Ba Sing Se, because, overall, especially from just watching this series, you definitely get the feel that there's just like no hope for the people in the lower ring. Like, it's, almost sort of like the worst place ever to sort of be at, and it's so much different from the way that Aang has sort of seen the world and the perspective there. So I guess it's a nice way to sort of try to like counterbalance things, to show that there is some sort of support system, that it isn't sort of like all doom and gloom. I think even in sort of the first part of the book, they try to sort of show that there's people living their lives, like it isn't like sort of the worst thing in the world, like you're not going to sort of have your life ended around any sort of corner or anything like that. Like there are, good people, like there are good people everywhere, right? So, it's a nice idea that there is, some sort of group that is sort of trying to support people, that they even have, members that are in the upper crust of society, right? That sort of realize that, the things in Ba Sing Se, as they are or they have been for, probably, hundreds of years at this point, need, a way to sort of balance things out, to sort of, support the people here. So no, I think it's a nice idea. It feels very sort of, Avatar-like, that there is something, that there's out there that's supporting things. So I think it fits within, the idea of things. It's not, too crazy that they have this sort of support system there.
Mm-hmm. And then they never really make the comparison in the book, but there's a little bit of like, this feels kind of Dao Fei-esque in terms of that kind of like, they're doing criminal activities, but it's like with an honorable kind of like edge to it. In this case, of course, it'll be revealed that it's kind of even more honorable than the more kind of bandit focused stuff that we saw in the Kyoshi era, but it's still that sort of idea. But yeah, the second half of this chapter is that Xuan brings Jin to meet one of the leaders of the Silver Fangs. So this is where we're introduced to Aunt Sumi, Merchant Yan, who, again, also does the same thing the other characters do before, where like it's not just a normal introduction, there's a bit of a test of like, hey, you spotted this character on the wall. What do you make of it? Like, what do you have to say about this calligraphy character? And Jin highlights this and that, it represents everything that's in a book, the hidden knowledge and stuff like that. There's the other layer that's about like corruption and stuff like that, which she kind of knows about through kind of, I guess, her father's work and stuff like that. And she gets the reveal here that say like, oh, Xuan kind of spoke highly of you, so we think that you might actually work out kind of well here. She's kind of shocked at this. And then we just kind of build to the idea that like she introduces herself a little bit more, that like, hey, I'm drinking this kind of Fire Nation focused tea. I had a mentor who spent time at a Fire Nation outpost. And we kind of cliffhang the chapter with the idea of, oh, is somehow the Silver Fang kind of run by people from the Fire Nation? What does that mean? Is she okay with that, given kind of what's happened previously and now? This one doesn't mean as much as you go forward, but obviously with reveals from later on in the book, it's like, okay, it's Order of the White Lotus focused, so people mixing nations and cultures, it doesn't like mean as much as you kind of think, but it's an interesting way to do the kind of cliffhanger here. They seem to do this with like all the characters. They do it they do a cliffhanger with Mok Mu-ling, a cliffhanger with Aunt Sumi. In a few chapters time we'll do a cliffhanger with Patron Wu. They maybe overdo it a little bit in terms of just introduce the character. Like none of them are going to kill her, but it works kind of here because Aunt Sumi's the important Silver Fang leader. But what are your thoughts on the introduction here of Aunt Sumi?
Yeah, I think the introduction is fine. It is, maybe a bit more sort of cliffy than it really needed to be, considering, it's just like the next, line in the next
Mm.
chapter where you sort of, realize the end situation of things. But in terms of, Jin and her sort of character and her sort of, realizing that, maybe she has to deal with, a situation that she hadn't particularly prepared for. I think it does, a good job of that, of her sort of, being, thinking like how far is she willing to go to support her friends and her family, right? Like that's the whole reason why she's joining the Silver Fangs in the first place here. So I think it's, it's good for that. It gets enough for that perspective of her character. And I think, it's cool. Again, we get to see her calligraphy skills, her educated background, how she's able to sort of discern things within the lines. Like, I think, that's cool. That's sort of, the mystery, the intrigue that they're sort of trying to build into the Silver Fangs, right? So I think that's cool. It sort of fits the mold of what we've been going for so far. This whole sort of like, secret sort of syndicate that's supporting people that people sort of know about by name but don't really know the sort of inner workings of things. So no, I think it all flows together.
Hmm. Into chapter 19, again, like you say, like literally like first line, peace, child. Okay, there's no issue here. We don't really address the Fire Nation part really. Instead, we just kind of go into the idea of like, okay, Ansumi notes that it's like younger and younger people joining the Silver Fangs these days, kind of, I suppose, noting just that things are reaching a bit of a boiling point as more and more people get involved in things. She asks Jin about like why is it you want to join us, and she talks about needing money for the contract. This is where we get the other reveal about Ansumi, that she is the judge who was mentioned as the one who kind of brokered the deal for the Wens to get the bakery back. That so like Su Ying could actually do the deal to kind of make this happen. Jin kind of hopes that like, oh, is there any way you can maybe revert this? But like, there's no easy way to kind of erase the terms or anything like that. But she basically notes that, hey, if you prove yourself over the next few weeks, you can get a position in our organization that will have like steady pay, like you'll get a lot of money, and that might allow you to settle the contract in full at a certain point. And yeah, she just mentions again, yeah, we facilitate a redistribution of wealth, but we'll explain that more when you're higher up in the ranks, basically. So yeah, you have to join the training here. There will be like a test, basically, to prove that you're actually kind of good enough to be a true member of the association. And she basically just says, Xuan will find you when like the training mission is basically about to happen, more or less. There's a kind of a section kind of after this where like there's a little bit of back and forth. Mostly it's just like Jin being like, hey, why didn't you tell me she was the judge? And he's like, I didn't want to make you nervous going into the meeting here. And we see how kind of proud he is to be part of this organization, and that even though he comes across as being somewhat high up, he's just a lackey who's been an initiate for a little bit longer than kind of Jin has. He does what he's told, including wrangling trainees, which is the kind of setup for what is about to happen. The chapter interestingly ends with a reference to like the change that Professor Om talked about from previous chapters, and that's kind of the idea of like, oh yeah, I guess more young people joining the Silver Fangs. That's kind of what he's kind of referring to. They're going to lead the change for the future. So interesting stuff in terms of the setup for like, okay, Jin's going to do a training mission with some other initiates. That's interesting. But what are your thoughts on chapter 19?
Yeah, so we get to see her actually sort of interact with someone higher up in the organization here in a more sort of detailed way. And I like the way that this sort of leads her, more into this, organization and sort of understanding, a bit more of what they're sort of about here and how, she, feels like there could be, a potential place for her, and that, these are the people that are, already sort of dealing with the sort of things that she's had to deal with, and, are the ones that have, helped or sort of not helped in various sort of situations here. So, it's cool that she's actually sort of making these connections, sort of understanding, the dealings of what's actually going on. Like when you see that she sort of realizes that this is the judge that sort of helped that whole situation, which, Aunt Sumi sort of mentions that isn't particularly one of her, sort of favorite names that she has to do, but, it's something that she's willing to do. And I think that sort of comes across pretty well to Jin here in terms of what she's going to have to do. And her and June sort of, discussing this a little bit before she sort of gets, of course, again, gets like, sort of upset with him and sort of his, way that he's sort of, angling sort of the situation here and mentioning there's other places for work. But Jin is very sort of, forceful in her sort of idea that this is what she's going to do and that, this will be the thing that sort of will help her sort of going forward. So no, I thought this was a really cool, setup for everything.
Mm. Yeah, because the doubt is definitely about, I suppose, the action side of the job. Like, he basically knows that she's not a particularly skilled earthbender. She can do the deliveries where it's just like you have to just act as a kind of person, as a delivery person, and she's done that fine. But actual missions with teams, can she do that? And she actually ends up impressing everyone, as we'll see shortly. Chapter 20, though, is where we get the really interesting reveal of some of our other kind of effectively main characters for the rest of the book, who are her fellow initiates. And she pretty quickly in the chapter gets introduced to Smellerbee and Longshot. They're the other two who have recently joined the Silver Fangs and are also going to be on this training mission here. So yeah, we get the book introduction of these two. She immediately asks like, "Hey, what's up with those names?" And they're just like, "Hey, it's a nickname. Have you ever heard of them before?" And the idea is that these two need an earthbender on their team. They don't initially want anyone else. They can do it by themselves. But no, they need an earthbender because they're the mission here is basically that they need to steal back an item from the house next door. But there's a safe that you need to use earthbending on to kind of undo the lock. And that's why Smellerbee and Longshot couldn't just do it on their own. But the problem here is that Jin only knows absolute basic fundamentals of earthbending, so Xuan is going to have to teach her the more delicate kind of lock-picking earthbending before the mission actually begins, basically. So it's this kind of complicated thing that she's never really done before. She's mostly done basic kind of power earthbending training, but it's this idea of like having to push with one hand, pull with the other to make a lock mechanism move around. And mostly we end the chapter with this as the first, I suppose, proper romantic tension moment, basically, between Jin and Xuan, where like they have to have their hands kind of right next to each other and get quite close to actually do the training. And that's kind of where the chapter comes to an end, with her not quite getting it just yet. But we'll see in the following chapter what happens with that. So yeah, what are your thoughts here? Smellerbee and Longshot as the kind of main cameo characters in the book.
Yeah, I mean, I think they work well, especially when we get to see them later on. I think, as far as like, characters that you could insert into the story that wouldn't sort of like, skew things very sort of heavily later on, timeline wise or content wise or anything like that. I think they're good ones for that. And they're fun characters. I think they were always sort of interesting from the show. I think that's why, a lot of people sort of remember them as sort of standout. And the fact that we do get to see them again, on their own in Ba Sing Se, it makes sense that they would sort of be here in terms of characters that sort of, know the Avatar, but aren't sort of so entrenched in that team that they have to be with the Avatar at any point in time. So no, I think that's cool that we get to see them here, the descriptions of them, from Jin's sort of perspective here, how, sort of unique and different they sort of seem, which as we read later on, we get to understand more and more about that. And of course, if you've already seen the show, you already understand, sort of their perspective, everything like that. But, just reading through this and seeing her sort of, come to terms with like sort of their nicknames and sort of their, abilities and sort of, Longshot's not really talking, although I think we see him more talk here than we've ever heard him ever talk before. So it's cool to get to see them in this sort of context and a different view from a different sort of perspective. I think it definitely adds, a good bit to the story here to have these characters that we do already know. And they're sort of the only really, ones that we would sort of get in this sort of way. There's a couple others, or one other at least, that I can think of off the top. But these are the ones that we are really sort of our new main characters, essentially.
Yeah, and it definitely works because they have a little bit of like missing parts to their story, kind of before and after their kind of Lake Laogai kind of main appearance, where like, yeah, after Jet got arrested, what were they up to? This is what they were doing. They had to find some way to make money, make connections. They joined the Silver Fangs. That makes sense. And then, of course, after the Lake Laogai situation, the last we saw them was them defending kind of Jet as he died, basically, as the team ran off. What did they do after that? And we actually get to that kind of filled in here because the appearances with those two is that they go from like Lake Laogai to like they show up in the Promise comic. And there's like a whole like what happened in between this, and this is actually serves quite well to fill that in because we actually got more with some of the rest of the Freedom Fighter members like Pipsqueak and the Duke, rather than like these two, which will be the main two Freedom Fighters after Jet. So it was a really good choice, I think, because yeah, they're here in Ba Sing Se, perfect characters to choose. But into chapter 21. So we dive a little bit into kind of how earthbenders do their earthbending here, where Schwen goes into the idea that he uses, I guess, music as a foundation for like what he kind of visualizes, I guess, his bending as. This is how he's able to really focus his bending, is like the harmonies, the resonance of the music. This doesn't quite work for Jin, but when she connects it to, I suppose, what she did in the past and does now, which is baking, earthbending through kind of baking and kind of cooking type stuff, this is what helps her to actually understand what Schwen is trying to teach her, and she finally actually gets it. So at this point she is ready to go on the mission, and then the rest of the chapter is just a really kind of quick rapid fire going through this kind of mission. Now admittedly it's the house next door, it's not like a crazy like we have to travel a lot for this, but it's just quickly Smellerbee and Longshot organize the infiltration. It's like a arrow shot up into the top of the building. Smellerbee kind of quickly, kind of cat-like, climbs up the outside of the building in a crazy fashion. Longshot pulls Jin up. Inside, the place is kind of covered in flowers all over the place because they were told that, like, the safe is behind something with a flower on it, but everything's a flower. So they take a while to acclimatize themselves to the area. They're running out of time. Eventually, they find the scroll. Behind it, there doesn't seem to be anything there. And then Jin gets up close and senses that there is a mechanism there with her earthbending, and kind of last second does manage to open the lock. They get the item, but they're out of time. The kind of guards are about to arrive, so Smellerbee just grabs Jin and hops off the roof in a kind of crazy cliffhanger ending where like Jin has never been in action like this before, whereas Smellerbee and Longshot are used to it. But Jin did her part of the job perfectly, basically. So pretty cool, nice quick action here for a relatively kind of basic mission, but nice stuff. What were your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, it is sort of a training mission, and when you do sort of figure out sort of the specifics behind it, I guess you could sort of understand, why it is the way it is. But from Jin's perspective, this is like, a harrowing sort of experience, especially with her, not being, an action-oriented character in any sort of regard. I mean, Smellerbee says that in like the last chapter that, she doesn't look like an earthbender, which I guess you could kind of understand that, right? Because she hasn't really been using her earthbending, right? Like she's been essentially hiding it because her grandfather, had the idea that that would keep her sort of safe. So, she doesn't really have, sort of, I guess you could say the figure or the development or sort of the typical, you could say, like temperament of a earthbender in any sort of way. Now, of course, we know earthbenders have, many different sort of personalities and temperament, depending on sort of how they view their earthbending and stuff like that. But she doesn't have sort of like even sort of the, I guess you could say, the core of it or whatever, because she, hasn't really been using her earthbending that much. And when she has, from what June sort of noticed, is sort of like things that she thought, could be passed over as just sort of someone being like really skilled with like throwing rocks and stuff like that. But here she actually has to get sort of a real sort of sense of her earthbending, using her sort of, I guess, pastry making, from working with the Wens and that sort of family, which is, I guess it's interesting that she thought of that as her sort of connection to earthbending, compared to say calligraphy, which is something that she's, probably been doing for a lot longer, right? So it's interesting to see that that's what sort of connected her to her sort of earthbending in this sort of moment here, which I think is cool. I like the way that there's, describing her, sensing the earthbending, how she's able to eventually find the safe and, actually open it to sort of get the prize inside, which even at that moment, they're not sort of completely sure, sort of like what it is. So it seems like there definitely were, probably purposely a lot of sort of holes left on this heist in terms of like what they actually had to do. It is a training mission. They should sort of figure it out on the fly, right? So no, I thought this was pretty cool, and they definitely sort of ramp it up at the end here to make it seem even more intense than it initially was.
Mm-hmm. Chapter 22, we highlight that Smellerby gives them a pretty controlled descent down the building, but they still have to run away from the guards. Smellerby and Longshot, we see their kind of weakness is just that they're not super familiar with the city, so they don't really know where to go. Jin helps guide them through some kind of back alleys, and they quickly kind of escape into the crowd, and she gets kind of buns for them, and she actually gets to kind of talk to them a little bit, and we see that Smellerby actually thought that she was going to be actually okay on the mission in the end. Longshot loses the bet over Jin, though I don't think they ever super heavily doubted her kind of at all. But the idea is that they are going to kind of break off for now, like go wherever they go, and they'll meet up the next day to deliver the item when the kind of heat kind of dies down. Then this is when they kind of arrive back in, and they meet the other leader of the Silver Fangs, who is the singer, not the judge, the singer, and this is Patron Wu, the most renowned performer in Ba Sing Se. And pretty much the idea is that we get another kind of cliffhanger shock ending to the chapter, where the item is revealed to be this kind of fancy war fan, and Patron Wu kind of points it at the team like, you didn't open it, did you? And the idea is, oh, what's going on here? Are they working for villains? But as we see, it's just, kind of the writer feeling like they need to end most of the chapters on a cliffhanger. This is definitely when it felt like a little overdone here. Just because I think with Patron Wu, you don't get too much on them across the whole book, like in comparison to, say, Aunt Sumi, where there's only like a few references really after this initial introduction scene, where I kind of feel like there's maybe room to do a little bit more with this character to get across what the full idea necessarily is here. But yeah, it's not too much on Patron Wu in this chapter, but it's just the idea of like the first stage of, I suppose, a proper friendship with Smellerby and Longshot, and then, okay, yeah, the group is still a criminal organization, basically. But what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, no, the group has, some shady dealings, even if this particular mission, has particular slant and angle to it. But no, I like that, our new core trio here, which will make a four, has this sort of, bond that they've had, which I think, is kind of the point of these sort of missions, right? Is to sort of get the group together to have this sort of cohesion, to see, where everyone's strengths lie in the situation. And the fact that Jin sort of knows the city like the back of her hand, or at least most of it, helps them get out of this sort of, chase situation. So I like that they have that, little bit of a scene here. Those are always sort of fun to see, and to get sort of the understanding of the city and the layout and how things work here. And yeah, no, meeting this another sort of leader of this organization is, definitely you can understand some of the tension here. I think you don't sort of understand maybe the seriousness of it, because like you're saying, we don't really know as much about this, new character, the singer. It has, any character has like, that sort of name, like the singer, the judge, like, they're important to some degree, but it doesn't feel like Jin at least knows as much about her to be sort of as threatened, other than the fact that, someone's pointing a war fan at her face. So, that sort of has some, tension to it, but the whole overall thing, I think we don't quite sort of grasp everything to make it sort of up there at that sort of level yet. But it's a good introduction, at least at the start for this new, them really becoming part of the organization.
We immediately start 23 with like, hey, it was actually just a proper test mission, and not just like that. Okay, it was a easy mission. Actually, it was a proper test mission. They were stealing from one of Patron Wu's friends, and the only thing that was actually real about the mission was the chase at the end. That if they got caught by guards, they would have actually been in trouble. But they wouldn't have actually got in trouble for just stealing from the vault, just from the actual person involved. So that's the whole kind of situation there. So yeah, pretty quickly after this, there's a little bit of a kind of nice kind of flavor here, where with the whole war fan situation, Patron Wu explains stuff that like this was Avatar Kyoshi's chosen weapon, and it's just this idea of this really fancy one, but it is actually a weapon when you kind of break it down, a weapon that's decorative as well as dangerous is sort of the idea there. But they're then pretty much inducted into the Silver Fangs. They have to swear this oath of loyalty, which is to protect those in our ranks a new family found, to leave no one behind, though the way may be treacherous, to speak no lies among us, for truth is our legacy. We so swear. And so yeah, they're initiates no more, they're proper members of the Silver Fangs, and they get all their protections and their wrath, basically. So they're fully involved now, and that's cool. So what are your thoughts on this here, the reveal of the mission actually being full-on test mission, and then their oath to join the ranks?
Yeah, I mean that feels kind of like a classic thing that like the first mission isn't quite as serious as you think, but the people that are doing it don't know that. So, it's a way to sort of control the sort of environment of the situation. But, there were still potential, consequences of the situation, if they actually got caught. So I like that they do keep, some of the real tension actually there. But no, them being able to sort of actually join the group, swear their loyalty to the group and really sort of, feel like they're part of this sort of, unity, this sort of group here, I think is cool. I think this is something that Jin hasn't really had up until this point. Like she's had it, sort of just by random with the Wen family and Susu. But this is something that she's actually really sort of gone on her own and sort of, realized that she can actually do. So it's a big, point for her character and her sort of development. So I think that's really, cool to see.
Mm-hmm. Second half of this chapter is that we kind of do a little bit of a kind of time skip a little bit. We see that her relationship with Xuan has improved now that they kind of both share this secret of being part of this organization and kind of no one else does. She kind of gets more involved with Xuan's kind of group of friends, again remembering the idea that like Jiang is no longer part of this, and she kind of realizes that at this point, but that like Ren De actually is someone also that she can be friends with. So she had some kind of preconceived notions about them that she kind of realizes are now wrong. She's no longer on the periphery of the group, she's kind of more involved in it. We see that everyone knows that the Kyoshi warriors have arrived in the city, which gives us a bit of a sense for where we are in the ATLA plot. Jin reflects on the Avatar and kind of what they could possibly do in this situation. There's a quick visit to the Wens where we see that Grandmother Wen is sick. They don't describe it as being like particularly serious, but obviously the extra work, I guess, is getting to her at this point. And then she meets up with Longshot and Smellerbee. And again, this is a few days after their induction into the Silver Fangs, so it gives time for Jin to have done a bunch of deliveries, but also them to have done a bunch of stuff off screen. And we see that Longshot and Smellerbee have both been crying, and they're both very upset about something, and Jin is like really taken aback. She gives some of the pastries to them, and they basically decide to bring her along with where they're going. And they head to this area called the Spring Overlook, though everyone in the city calls it the Weeping Hills. And this is a place where people who can't afford a plot to bury can just bury their dead. And we arrive at this kind of fresh grave because these two are mourning a recent loss. And the chapter ends with another day in Ba Sing Se. Obviously, next chapter will catch us up with the full details of this. But, of course, anyone reading this should know exactly what this is and kind of what this means. So we're actually getting the funeral of Jet, something we didn't get in the show because Team Avatar had to leave to pursue Long Feng so quickly after Jet was injured in that episode. So this is a really good use of Smellerbee and Longshot, if not just to get a scene like we're about to get at the start of the next chapter. But what are your thoughts on this ending of this chapter?
Yeah, I think it definitely sets the stage for something that we haven't seen before, which is cool to actually get in this sort of book where, you potentially wouldn't think that you would get something that really sort of would, flesh out something that we sort of saw in the story. So I thought this was really good that we get the setup of, there's a bit of time that has progressed. We can see Jin and sort of, Smellerbee and Longshot are sort of, doing, pretty well in the Silver Fangs. Like they've, got some more missions. So they've become more of a sort of like a unit here, basically. They're not sort of so sort of random and uncomfortable with each other, even if they're not particularly, close as friends or anything like that, but they're still on, decent terms here. So I think that that's, it makes sense that after everything here, and especially with, Longshot and Smellerbee's sort of, silent communication, that they would sort of, bring her along on this sort of, remembrance that they're going to have for their fallen comrade that Jin doesn't quite understand at this point in time, but she can already sense that something serious has happened that she isn't quite aware of yet.
Mm-hmm. Going into chapter 25, we quickly get the idea that kind of, Jin is told effectively that this is Jet, because she overhears them when their kind of words to Jet. I'm sorry we weren't able to help you, Jet. I hope you're at peace now. Longshot then says, farewell, brother. And they're, of course, really upset about this. And as they're kind of still grieving, saying their goodbyes to Jet, the guards come up saying, like, hey, there's a bigger kind of curfew here. You're not meant to be here. Jin goes down to kind of deal with them to say, like, hey, give them a few minutes here. They've just lost someone. But they do have to leave pretty quickly, which is so where Jin then tells them, like, hey, we'll go to Pow's. We'll talk about this. You can tell me about who this person was. And this is an important scene because this is where I suppose this trio kind of truly bonds effectively, where they tell her about the leader of their group who helped them when they were lost and alone. We do get references to the Duke, Pipsqueak, other people that were in their group, and that it was in the forest near Gaipan where we actually get the interesting reveal that Da Ying is just across the river from Gaipan, so they were kind of inadvertently always kind of close to each other to a certain degree. There is also a brief Great Divide reference here, which is interesting. There's a very quick 1-paragraph backstory for Smellerbee and Longshot. So Smellerbee's is that her family farmed in the mountains more to the north of Gaipan, closer to Taku, which we know from a little bit from ATLA, the Herbalist, and also from the Yang Chen books as one of the Shang cities. And this was another casualty of the Fire Nation spread eastward across the continent. Longshot's backstory is that his village fell victim to attacks by Fire Nation archers, and he vowed to one day be able to best them. That was why he took on the bow as his chosen weapon. And the idea is that these two remember, they'll kind of never forget, they know where they came from and kind of what they need to do going forward. And that one day they'll go back. That's the idea, that they'll all go back to kind of where they came from at some point. But after this, the idea is that they do grow closer. They don't really speak of Jet again, but the idea is that they kind of exchange skills. Jin teaches them how to navigate the lower ring, and they basically teach her kind of freedom fighter skills, I guess, more parkour style stuff to better navigate around the place as well. So that's that. And then, interestingly, we end this chapter with they go on deliveries together, where like they sort of accompany Jin as her kind of bodyguards, which comes across as normal in the upper ring, where everyone's accompanied by like someone. So that's what's happening here. On the way back from a Mokmu Ling delivery, Jin encounters Susu again, and this time is determined to get through to her. But this time, of course, Smellerbee and Longshot are there with her. So you can sort of see where this is going. We're like, okay, they're going to see that Jin's friend is brainwashed, bring her up to speed, and this is where the plot's properly going to like crack open into the bigger picture, where like, what they revealed here didn't reveal their full involvement in what happened with Lake Laogai, in that Jin doesn't even make the connection that Jet is the person Lee was fighting previously. So there's still like kind of missed information a little bit of all over the place here, which is kind of interesting. But yeah, I really like this chapter as like the real bonding chapter for this team for the book. But what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, no, I think the bonding that they have here, sort of the sit down at pals, is really, it feels like it's something that the group sort of needed, because they were just sort of like on, they were just sort of on like good work terms, but they weren't really, they didn't really have that sort of interpersonal sort of connection, and this really sort of, sets the stage for them. They tell, where they're from. They realize that they were all actually really, close to each other, in terms of where they were geographically before, the Fire Nation came and everything like that. So, no, I think this was definitely sort of, it feels like this was at the point where it was needed to have, sort of the greater connection to where they're willing, in the next chapters to actually open up and sort of explain sort of the more sort of, things that they've sort of held back before. So no, I thought this was really cool. It would have been interesting, if Mushi and Lee were still there, how that would have played out. But I think the way that they have it sort of set up here, where they're sort of, slowly sort of building up to sort of the information that they sort of actually need to sort of discuss with each other, it's actually done pretty well. I think that build up feels like it's been pretty well sort of planned throughout the whole thing so far, I think.
Mm-hmm. So from there, we go into chapter 25. So this is the kind of encounter with Susu. She goes up to talk to her again, kind of trying to get through. Again, Jin is not aware yet that this is brainwashing. So she thinks that Susu is effectively just trying to protect her by pretending that she doesn't know her. But this should be a situation where actually there's no one to interrupt us. She's actually found Susu with no attendants. So there's no one where, like, if she said something casually to Jin, that they'd overhear it and Susu would get in trouble. She should be able to say something, some signal to Jin that it's okay, but I can't talk much right now. But it just doesn't work. She tries to mention Susu's family to her, and none of it ever seems to get through. There's maybe a slight sense when she mentions that the grandmother is sick, where there's a slight pause, but nothing really more than that at all. To the point where, like, Jin begins to get quite kind of animated and upset about this, and Smellerbee and Longshot have to step in to prevent this from becoming an incident that will draw the attention of the guards. So they stop Jin from doing something that would get them all caught, at which point they see Susu kind of get off the train and go over to join up with the Dai Li. So they realize, like, wait, what's going on here? She's working for the Dai Li. What's going on? Which then leads into, okay, now is the time for, they trust her more. Smellerbee and Longshot kind of bring Jin up to speed with the full scope of what's happened here. That, look, the Dai Li are the agents of the Grand Secretariat. There was a conspiracy against the Earth King that the Avatar was able to stop. We were involved in all of this. This is the reason Jet died, was because of this kind of situation kind of happening and coming about. There's major problems in Ba Sing Se, and Jet was brainwashed by the Dai Li. That girl was also brainwashed by the Dai Li. So, like, there's no buying her back from this situation. Like, what you've been doing up to now isn't actually going to get her back. So this is where the idea is the secret base, like Laogai, that's where they're going to have to go to get information on this, potentially, to get her back. And so that's the setup for like the next stage of the book, is that Jin has this kind of solo kind of mission that she wants to go on, but her new friends, Smellerby and Longshot, are going to go with her because they, of course, have been there already. So really, really interesting stuff here, where like this is the moment where Jin suddenly becomes aware of the bigger picture in Ba Sing Se, which I think was a really cool moment to finally see happen. But what are your thoughts on this chapter?
Yeah, no, I agree. Her sort of, understanding, I guess, sort of the real sort of, I guess you could say like corruption of the city, really comes into play here. And it's something that she doesn't even, she didn't even really sort of like consider this as a situation. She was so sort of set on sort of, Susu just sort of protecting her because of the new position that she's in, and Susu just sort of like playing things off as, she might have done when she was sort of, in control of her faculties and stuff like this. But no, we find out that, she really doesn't have, any sort of, idea currently of what Jin is actually sort of talking about. And yeah, it did seem like, there was a second there where maybe she sort of, got through to her. And we can see, later on how sort of the cracks sort of start to fall into place in terms of her memory and her brainwashing. But right now, it definitely feels like she's in full sort of Judy mode here, and she's not really, letting anything sort of slip through here. And, it's sort of understandable that Jin would get sort of animated in this situation and wouldn't really, sort of, want to sort of stand for the situation. And if it wasn't, for Smellerby and Longshot, she probably would have ran up to her, even in front of Dai Li. And, of course, that would have caused a whole bunch of more sort of issues here, right? So it definitely, speaks to the real sort of, I guess you could say, seriousness of the situation here. And everything has sort of built up to this one point.
Chapter 26 is mostly a setup chapter for chapter 27. It's mostly the idea that Jin goes to Xuan to organize a meeting with the Silverfang's leaders so that she can kind of facilitate the mission that she kind of wants to do. And Xuan is just like, okay, I'll do that if you want. It could take a little bit of time to organize here. There's a quick sense that like she kind of goes to over here. She meets with the family, the Wen family. They kind of thank her for a lot of what's going on there. And then we just build up to the kind of arrival at the big meeting with the Silverfang leaders, which is interesting because it's not just to deal with like Jin's request. It's just like it's everyone's been called here if you're a Silver Fangs person. So they highlight the kind of secret way to get into the meeting, but we end the chapter right before it's about to begin. So not too much, at least for me, to kind of say about this one. It's just like, yeah, it's getting us from the information we learned last chapter to the big chapter 27. But what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, it definitely is more of a transitional chapter. I do like that they do have at least a part of Jin and sort of Zoin sort of like talking. She sort of, explains a little bit more of what's going on with Susu and sort of the involvement with the Dai Li, because I think that sort of helps to get across sort of even more sort of the seriousness of the situation here. Because like we already knew sort of that, the judge was involved with the situation, that there was a potential buyout for the contract, but now it definitely feels like that buyout was just sort of put there just to sort of appease people and, didn't really have any sort of play on things. So it definitely gets across the more seriousness of the situation here. But yeah, just the fact that there is sort of a big meeting coming that isn't, sort of just handed through like sort of secret messages, which is what, Jin's sort of been doing the whole time, right? Definitely speaks that there's something more happening, but they don't quite sort of understand sort of what's going on yet, because there's a lot of moving pieces that we're not, sort of privy to.
Mm-hmm. Chapter 27 is where we really see the plot of ATLA like properly overlap and affect the plot of this book, because the big thing that they announce here straight away, it's the singer, it's Patron Wu announcing this, is that we've received multiple confirmations. The Fire Nation has infiltrated the palace and taken over the Dai Li. The Earth King has disappeared. So big kind of freak out moment here. They will open the gates to the Fire Nation army soon, and you will see their war machines upon our streets and in the skies above. Tonight at midnight, there will be one gate remaining still open to those passing through, the northeastern gate. And immediately, a bunch of people in the room just immediately leave to head for that gate to get out of the city as soon as possible. The advice to the people who are going to remain is that go into hiding, try and kind of keep your heads down, go unnoticed if you can. They can burn us, but the earth remains, and that's the kind of chant that's kind of led here. And the idea is that, the Silver Fangs are going to have to go quiet for a little bit, but we're going to kind of try and keep going in the background. But the big point here is that this ruins the idea of any potential mission to Lake Laogai, because there's much bigger concerns right now, which is that the city has fallen. Basically, it's going to fall very, very soon. Can the mission even happen at all? So the idea from here is that Jin immediately goes back to Gong Gong. She sees that this is one of his bad days, so she kind of lies to him about what's going on, saying it's just like construction work going on. And they head into the house to kind of keep their heads down. But then there's a knock at the door. A notice is put up on the door. And this is the kind of like big moment here. The notice is, "Citizens of Ba Sing Se, you've been blessed by the benevolence of the great Fire Lord Ozai, divine ruler of the Fire Nation, to welcome you as a territory in the grand joining of nations to become one. Follow us to your glorious destiny." And this is where the invasion begins. So like a massive boulder lands on a building nearby. Fires going off all over the place. Children are crying, people calling out for help. The invasion has begun. Just like that, like the story's gone from like 0 to 100 like immediately. And yeah, we've fully been overtaken by the ATLA plot, and we see that, oh yeah, like I suppose about in or around the time when like Team Avatar is kind of flying off to kind of try and rebuild, this is what's happening to the normal people in the city as it actually gets taken over. So what are your thoughts on this kind of convergence of plots?
Yeah, it's definitely, cool to see sort of, this actually come into play because, we have sort of the point of reference from the animated show of, what happened to the city and sort of, what was going on there, but not really sort of, at the ground level, what people actually had to deal with here. So, just getting the idea that, some people who had, a little bit of an advance notice were, potentially able to sort of escape, to go where, who knows, considering, the whole world essentially is, going to be taken over. At least that's the idea from the Fire Nation at this point here. But, not many people can actually sort of, just run away from the problems, especially the ones that are sort of in the lower ring here. So, all the rest of them just sort of have to figure out how to sort of keep their heads low and sort of survive things. But I do like that, at least our group here is still going to try to figure out some way to get into Lake Laogai. Like they didn't, abandon June and sort of her idea to save her friend. They just can't have the support of the Silver Fangs because, whole Earth Kingdom is essentially going to be taken over here. So there is still, her own sort of personal mission that she has to do, but there's also a larger plot at play here that, definitely has some precedence over her own sort of individual situation here, but she's trying to sort of, at least hide a little bit from her grandfather, who she, essentially knows that this is too much for him to sort of accept at this point in time here, especially with the notice and everything like that. So it definitely feels like this is definitely a ramp up this situation, and definitely get this feel sort of the tension and sort of the turmoil of, them actually sort of being invaded, which we didn't really get to see before because we just sort of saw sort of the aftermath and sort of how it was resolved.
Chapter 28 starts the big kind of action section here, where immediately Smellerbee is running for Jane. She's calling for help. Longshot needs help because she kind of reveals that one of the attacks hit the building that they were staying in, and Longshot got kind of trapped in the rubble. And Smellerbee is really, really distraught at the idea that she might lose Longshot. So Jin immediately heads out to help him. When they find him, she is able to use her earthbending to help get him out. And Longshot is okay. He has an injured ankle. And it's kind of a mid-level injury. They kind of go back and forth on just how bad it really is. He'll be back for the final battle, but like he's out of the upcoming mission is sort of the idea that they kind of go for here. But they do really get across the importance of Smellerbee to Longshot, Longshot to Smellerbee here, because Smellerbee is kind of crying here at the concept of nearly losing Longshot here. But of course, their house has just been basically, where they were staying has just been wrecked. Where did they go? So she decides to bring them all back to her house. That's the kind of thing that she decides right at the end here. There's enough room for us all back there. They just have to do whatever they can to survive all of this. So cool sequence here. It obviously, for plot reasons, they decided they didn't want Longshot going on the Lake Laogai kind of mission. And so they wanted to have him have this injury. It does allow Jin to have this kind of cool moment using her now kind of slightly more advanced earthbending skills to kind of jump into action here. And then just kind of highlighting, of course, the friendship that's now here between these three. So it's a nice moment of everyone coming together to try and survive the invasion. But what are your thoughts here on the action starting up?
Yeah, no, I agree. It definitely does bring them, closer together here, especially, a life for life and everything like that here. So I thought it was cool, just her, I guess it's just more confidence building for Jin as a character, right? Like, we start off this whole sort of story with her, sort of hiding her abilities and not even really having sort of like training, as opposed to, other characters who we know who have also sort of hidden their abilities. She's just not even bothered to sort of learn anything other than sort of the basics, just so that she doesn't hurt herself with her abilities here. So the fact that she's able to sort of, say that she has the confidence to do this in this situation that, feels like it's a lot more of a physical type of earthbending that she's had to do before. It's been more sort of like on the subtle side of things. So I guess here we get to see her have a little bit of more sort of physicality with her abilities here. But yeah, no, just getting our group together here, showing that sort of Longshot is sort of at least temporarily sort of out of the fight, even if he isn't sort of, overly seriously injured here. But just the fact that we're going to get them, sort of all together in one group, just sort of helps move things, together for the plot wise and everything like that. So they can actually sort of plan where things are going to go, in the future.
Mm-hmm. Next is chapter 29. So they eventually get back to Jin's house as Smellerbee kind of settles Longshot down. Jin goes to check on Gong Gong. She finds him holding the notice that's been put on the front of their door in his hand. So I guess he now realizes the invasion has come in and something has happened while she's been gone. His condition has drastically kind of worsened. It's the worst he's ever been. She doesn't know exactly what's happened, but just that she needs to get a doctor to him immediately. So the situation here is that Smellerbee is going to stay here and basically protect the house. She's going to protect Longshot, protect Gong Gong. Jin is going to go to the apothecary to try and get Dr. Jan, Xuan's mother, and yeah, she makes this kind of crazy mad dash across the city. Again, in the middle of like all the like tundra tanks and stuff like that coming in. She's avoiding firebenders, going over the top of buildings and stuff like that. It's a dangerous kind of journey to even travel this far. And the idea is like she kind of slightly cuts herself along the way as she kind of makes her way kind of up over the kind of entrance to the apothecary. And we end the chapter with her using her earthbending to try and kind of get herself down without kind of injuring herself. So yeah, the pacing really kind of kicks up here into gear. Lots of just stuff happening here as we kind of have the action really build. And yeah, just the idea of like one of our characters is injured, something has happened to Gong Gong, and Jin is doing what she can. Really cool chapter. But what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think, it's definitely, from it being sort of like a slow build up over, most of part one to here, it definitely, has, increased in pace and, what's going on, which I guess, makes sense. Like once the invasion happens, like there's no real sort of like slowing things down, like it's just going full force here. So get to see Jin sort of actually it's sort of in action here. Like she's, she mentions that she's sort of driven by fear of the situation, right? Like, so she's not really holding anything back. She's using all of the skills and sort of, techniques that she's developed up until this point to push herself, past farther than, where she even thought that she could go at this point in time. So I like, seeing this character who, initially wasn't really sort of action oriented in any sort of way, sort of, figure out how to be it in the moment. I think that's, always cool when you get to see your characters sort of become that sort of like in real time essentially here. And, not that it's flawless by any, mention of the imagination. Like you can see her get, cut up along the way quite a bit, and we get to see how that plays out, later on in the next chapter as well, with Juan and everything like that. So, no, I thought that was cool. I like to mention too, Avatar Kyoshi and how sort of, her and her sort of, group of people were able to sort of do what she's doing now, but obviously they had a lot more finesse than what she's had since she doesn't really have any training in that sort of abilities to sort of float in the air and stuff like that. But it shows, maybe she might have potential in that later on. I don't know. But, it's cool that we get that reference, regardless here, and just to see how she's able to sort of deal with the situation to get where she needs to go.
Yeah, the dust stepping reference is actually really cool because, yeah, it highlights that this is the level that Jin is not really anywhere near just now. And then and that's the whole point of this book is that even that book where like that was somewhat early in Kyoshi's kind of training, she still had the potential to do a crazy move like that, whereas Jin is even slightly better now, still not quite there, and just that kind of difference of like, yeah, if this was Team Avatar, they'd just kind of steamroll their way through the city, but for Jin, just like traveling across like 3 streets is like this ultimate stealth mission, and I like that they get that across, and that like even by the end of the book, Jin's at a point where, okay, if she sneaks up on people, she can maybe take out a guard or two, but the second it turns into a proper fight, it's going to be a challenge. And I think they did that kind of balancing of like the levels of different characters kind of pretty well. But we move into chapter 30. So she drops down, is nearly killed by the apothecary's guard with a bow until Xuan steps in to like calm him down. We find out immediately Dr. Jan has been taken by the Dai Li, so she's not even here. He says that he's going to go with her to check on Gong Gong, but he makes sure to fix up the cuts on her hands kind of first, just before they go. So we kind of begin to set up the idea that, he's kind of inspired by like, whoa, like he's absolutely shocked to see her here in the middle of all of this, but he's going to do what he can to help her. So yeah, he sets the guard to, like watch everyone that's kind of left here. And then yeah, we end with the cliffhanger here is kind of an interesting one because it's kind of like a fun cliffhanger here of just like, oh, who's this girl kind of staring down at them, having this slightly intimate moment, and then it's like, oh, this is going to be us getting to meet one of his sisters for the first time, which is kind of fun. But yeah, I like this one here because it's just like, yeah, we go there, we get the key detail. His mother's been, taken. We'll get the full details on this later on in the book. But for now, there's no proper doctor, just Xuan who has a little bit of training. So what are your thoughts on this chapter?
Yeah, I think, it's cool to see that he's willing at this point to sort of support Jin and sort of, after her sort of crazy ability to sort of, get to this place, throughout all of the sort of, war and the invasion going on. I like that there's at least a little bit of a calm moment here. Like there's still, explosions and tanks and everything going on around there. But, there's nice to have at least a little bit of calm in this situation before they, dive right back into it just in the next chapter here. And, getting to meet his sort of family that we have heard about. And, we've seen how that's sort of affected and sort of molded him and how he's actually, used those skills, for the Silver Fangs and for Jin. To actually get to see them, I think it's a nice piece to actually have.
Mm-hmm. At the start of 31, we of course get the idea here. Jin meets Layla, who is Xuan's sister, and the reveal here is just that she basically teases the two of them because I guess she can see that they're kind of gradually growing into kind of being a bit of a couple. She reveals to Jin that like, oh hey, no wonder he kind of likes you so much, and Jin's a bit like, he doesn't like me, and she's just like, yeah, sure he doesn't, because she's like shocked at how kind of unaware of their dynamic she kind of is. So it's a fun little interaction back and forth here. But they kind of head back, and we get the kind of description of their kind of backtracking here. This is, I think, the debut of the reveal that Xuan's actually afraid of heights, which helps to explain maybe one or two little moments from previously in the book. But they pretty quickly get back to Smellerbee and stuff like that. Of course, they have to reveal to her that, hey, Dr. Jan was captured. This is the best we can do right now. He reveals basically his assessment of Gong Gong is that something has happened to his heart. His breathing isn't great. The best we can do right now is kind of keep him cool and calm. And then he goes to maybe more assessing Longshot, who has the more kind of obvious injury he might be able to do something about. And we basically get him sort of like, I guess like relocating his ankle or something like that, because they definitely say he does something to Longshot's ankle to kind of snap back into proper position. So we get that whole situation. This is where Xuan volunteers for the Lake Laogai mission with Longshot out, and then the chapter ends with Jin and Gong Gong having this kind of nice moment as like Gong Gong's kind of stabilized a little bit. He praises her for like all the responsibilities that she's had to deal with given what's happened to him. He should be looking out for her, but she's had to look after him. He is proud of her as they kind of fall asleep. And it feels like kind of it's meant to be this kind of calming, stabilizing situation of like, we'll fix things in the morning, but it's a pretty sudden shock at the start of the next chapter, which we'll get to. But again, I think this is really good action stuff happening here. It's fast paced, but it's in the right way, and that like you don't need to spend multiple chapters, having the same journey in reverse and stuff like that. So they're doing the right things in my mind here. But what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I think, the fact that I guess maybe that maybe he knows the route a little bit better, or the fact that they go underground versus going above ground, they're able to sort of, make the trip without as much issue here, or just the fact that there's two of them, makes it an easier way to go about it here. But no, I like that Xuan is able to sort of, assess the situation to the best of his abilities here, and he's definitely a lot better with the more sort of, physical ailment that Longshot has here, and is actually able to sort of set the ankle in place. So I like that, we do get to see that he has, some skills. He has learned some things from his mother at the apothecary, even if that isn't sort of like the profession that he, thought, or he was, currently sort of being educated to go into. So no, I like that he has, additional skills, which I guess we sort of already figured that he has, various skills that he can use in different ways, and he is already part of the Silver Fangs and has been part of it for a while, so it kind of makes sense here. But yeah, no, I think it definitely feels like they're sort of, they have a nice sort of touching moment here at the end that, seems like it could be sort of the possible reconciliation of things sort of to come here, but it feels like just with, everything else that's sort of been building up into this story here, that things just continually sort of get worse until they can eventually get better.
Mm-hmm. The last chapter for this part is chapter 32. So again, literally 2-3 paragraphs in, we see the arrival of the doctor at last, and Jin's just immediately told that, like, I'm sorry to inform you, your grandfather is gone. He passed away, I guess, in the middle of the night. There's no further discussion about it. She's just so taken aback by this that, like, how did she not wake up or realize that, last night would have been the last time she got to speak to him? All these things kind of going through her head. And then they kind of just describe that she goes into like a little bit of a daze as like the rest of the day sort of passes, and just a lot of the organizing of stuff kind of happens. And it kind of becomes clear that like Xuan being there is like really, really important to kind of facilitate like organizing a lot of this stuff, which is that they have to bury Gong Gong. And so we get the very interesting kind of lower ring ritual for how they kind of bury someone who's kind of well known in the lower ring, which is that they kind of carry his body through the city on a wagon, and nearly everyone kind of like, takes a turn kind of helping to kind of drag the wagon along, and it's part of the ritual. Then when they get to the Weeping Hills where they're going to bury him, everyone digs a little bit to kind of help with the situation, and the idea is that you then return the favor the next time someone else dies. That's how the lower ring kind of community ends up working. So they bury Gong Gong, and then afterwards you see the other ritual of everyone holding candles up out the window as a kind of memorial for the loss of one of their own. And they kind of compare it a little bit, contrast it to what happened with Jet, where like no one really knew Jet, so Smellerbee and Longshot just had to kind of bury him on his own, and they were the only two that really knew him. And then Gong Gong, actually everyone kind of knew. It's a really nice moment that really gets across the kind of that lower ring community aspect of the book. But then the end to part 2, the setup for part 3, is that Jin immediately wants to go straight back into action in a way. For Gong Gong, she doesn't want to wait any longer. She wants to do the Lake Laogai mission, get Susu back, do what she kind of always had planned to do. And now that the city's been taken over, it's like, well, no better way to do it now, with the idea being that I guess the Daily will be distracted with controlling the city, that they'll probably not be overly focused on their base, which recently had an incident happen in, is sort of the logic. And it's just the idea that Jin is ready for this. She's not just kind of forcing herself to move on. No, this is what she needs to do now going forward. So an interesting way to kind of end the parts, and they kind of did that well, with the end of part 1 being another kind of big thing kind of happening in her life, and now part 2 ends with this, the death of Gong Gong. Really shocking in terms of like, given how eager this book has been for a cliffhanger, that they didn't do a cliffhanger kind of death for Gong Gong, and instead actually kept the surprise by having it take place right early on in the middle of the next chapter. But what are your thoughts here on our final chapter here?
Yeah, I think it definitely does a good job of setting up the next sort of major mission that we've already sort of been building up to. And I think, the fact that we almost get sort of like a sad lull before with the passing of Gong Gong, I think, it's a way to sort of, I guess you could essentially say sort of like clear the situation of what, Jin is going to do next, and what's going to sort of drive her purpose going forward, which is saving another friend that she can hopefully save and has a better sort of plan and people to support her, and it's something that she can actually see it could potentially actually having some sort of success. And of course we know that all plans sort of have things that go wrong during them, but here we can see that the rest of the group has plans, and they're willing to get sort of supplies and sort of set up the situation in the best way sort of possible going forward. And she just sort of needs a new thing to sort of focus on, right? So I think Smellerbee and Longshot are definitely sort of very sort of like you can definitely tell that they're super sort of understanding of the sort of situation here, and you can see sort of the compassion that they have, considering they essentially just went through something just like this just not too long ago. So I think you definitely get sort of the emotional beat of this whole chapter going forward that leads you to sort of the next big sort of plot point of the story.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's also interesting just in terms of maybe like expectations kind of heading into the book, is that like I almost expected the book to maybe go up to this point where we end effectively with like the takeover of Ba Sing Se, and that's maybe where we leave it, with the idea that like Jin had some sort of an arc that took place up to this point, and then it's pretty normal after that. So it was a little bit surprising going through the book for the first time to be like, oh, we're through book 2 at this point. Like we're now into like effectively the gap period between books, and that we actually continue going into part 3 all the way into book 3 right up to the end of the series. Where were your thoughts at with that? Just that like you're at this point like 3/4 or so of the way through the book, and we're all the way up to book 2. Like we know nothing about Jin after this point. What were your thoughts on the kind of timeline?
Yeah, no, I think the timeline is pretty cool. I mean, I think it's really good that they do continue forward because I think, if they were to just sort of end it at this sort of beat here, it definitely would feel kind of sort of like empty if they did it as is, which I'm sure they would have tweaked it differently if they did sort of end it here. But the fact that we are getting more, that we are able to continue her story, I think it definitely, it adds even more to her character. And I think especially when we find out sort of, with Zuko and stuff like that, I think it makes sense to me that they would sort of continue at least to some degree, just so we can have a bit of that sort of resolution, since that's something that people sort of always are sort of curious and ask about. And not that everyone sort of is completely happy with the way that it ended, of course, but no, I think that it really helps that we do have, some sort of resolution on that sort of front, as far as the story going forward. Because yeah, it definitely could have ended a lot earlier, and we could have just been okay with that. But I think with the addition of sort of like Smellerby and Longshot, it sort of makes sense that we would sort of push it a bit forward, just because we know, there are stories, there are character beats that do go past this point that would be cool to actually sort of understand them, even just for the city in general, since we do know, the invasion does end and that there is a resolution to the situation. And there's so much more that goes on, and not that we would even be sort of like privy to it at sort of like Jin's sort of level of her sort of like interaction with the city, because she's from the lower ring, so of course she's not going to know what sort of happens in sort of like the upper echelons of the society, right? But from her perspective, we get to see sort of what actually is going to be of the city, of people who probably felt a lot of the force of the actual Earth Fire Nation actually coming to the city and taking things over.
Mm-hmm. And I do think as well, like the really kind of clever point in all of this is that like we're building up the community of the lower ring of Ba Sing Se so much, and then one of the big points in the finale is like the retaking of Ba Sing Se, and that like, was it really just done by like our kind of 6 old master characters or whatever, and that's just it, and the idea that like, oh no, here's like the other side of that actually this book does a really good job of building up, that this book shows like Iroh, Zhang or whatever from the perspective of the normal people in the city, as they also do their bit to also take back the city. I think that's the other kind of clever part of it as well, that like, yeah, like it's our characters here taking back their city, which I think is important as well. But yeah, there's still a lot of stuff to happen in that. Like obviously we're going to the Lake Laogai base, and immediately that means, okay, we're going to resolve some unresolved kind of plot threads there, because Team Avatar just left that kind of rushing after Long Feng, and there's a lot of stuff that we need to come back to there. But then you realize that like, oh yeah, there's other big plot points that still have to happen, like what happens during the eclipse, during the comet, and it's actually quite cool what we eventually get to overall. But yeah, we'll cover that on the next podcast, which, I don't know, might be next week, might be the week afterwards. Depends on what the scheduling is like. But we're through quite a bit of the book, obviously, at this point here, where, yeah, it's like 2/3 pretty much exactly of the way through the book. So there's like 1/3 left. And it's, again, a lot of rapid-fire chapters, because it's pretty action-focused, kind of, once we kind of get going as well. I'd say the final point on this is just that, like, ultimately romance is a kind of big part of the book. What are your thoughts on, as we end part 2, on kind of how would you describe the kind of positioning of Jin and Xuan's relationship, where they're obviously not a couple yet, but it seems like people around them are beginning to see them in that way, and Jin's beginning to have her first realizations of like, oh, is that what's actually kind of happening between the two of us? Where do you view the relationship at this point, 2/3 of the way into the book?
Yeah, I mean, I think for the most part, I think, it did, enough of the sort of back and forth to sort of, lay sort of like the groundwork with it. And I think, especially with the sisters, I think that's where it really sort of, obviously sort of comes into focus here, where they sort of make it, pretty apparent. And, she sort of has been sort of like on that sort of wavelength, since her date with Lee, sort of, is this, something that she could, potentially have going forward in the future here, and needing, at least from her perspective, in of terms of just having somebody else there to sort of support her in her doings here. And she has the wins, but she sort of lost Susu, which was her sort of main support here. So this is sort of the development of a new one that can sort of help her sort of going forward in the future here. And I think, they've done enough to sort of, I guess you could say, like, lay the groundwork here that doesn't really have any sort of, conflicts of interest or anything like that. So I think, for the most part, they've done a enough job so that when we eventually do get to that later on, it's like, not a crazy thing or anything like that.
Yeah, especially in part two, they do a good job at kind of getting rid of the sort of hurdles that were put in place in the early scenes between them, and that, like, okay, yeah, Jin's completely past all of that because she's actually friends with his friends now, and she kind of realizes that it wasn't all on him handling those situations badly, like it was partly her as well. And yeah, we're gradually building to, like, he's become an important part of her life, especially now with Gong Gong gone. He's been there for her, and then it'll only get more and more important and into the upcoming stuff where they go on the next mission together, and then the mission after that, more specifically, it's just the two of them, and it gets to, I think, a pretty good point, and I think by the end is actually a pretty really well done relationship. But we'll talk more about that next time out. But yeah, that's been episode 296 of the Avatar Online podcast. It's been myself and Greg. Thanks for listening, and bye.